I think I'm not quite sure what time I'm going to be boarding. So if we go first, that will just give me a bit of breathing space. I'd really appreciate that.
All right, so in that case, we'll start with Karen and Liz, and then we'll have Julia and then Pamela. And hi, everybody, welcome. We'll start in, I guess, 1 minute. So welcome, everybody, to this wonderful panel. I'm very excited to be chairing this evening. So our panel title is Writing Ethically, Ethical Writing. And we have 4 wonderful panels today, 2 of whom will be presenting jointly. And our 2 joint presenters will be beginning for us this evening. So we're going to be starting with their paper, which is entitled, Could She See Her? Writing Ethically as Feminist Autoethnographers with Virginia Woolf. And the panelists for that paper this evening are Karen Madden, who is a PhD candidate in the School of Education at the University of Queensland, whose doctoral dissertation is entitled, Can I Be Feminist Here? A Critical Autoethnographic Perspective of Feminist Leadership in Australian Girls' Schools. Karen's doctoral thesis proposes feminist theory has more to offer leaders of girls' schools than conventional leadership scholarship. As Dean of Research and Engagement in an Australian girls' school, Karen's own story of leadership in educational contexts and the stories of her fellow leaders of girls' schools are central to her critical and creative autoethnographic work. Together with Liz, Karen has taken some recent radical departures in academic writing, including as a contributor to Doing Rebellious Research in and Beyond the Academy, co-edited collection from 2022. I get to find that one, sounds great. Co-edited by Elizabeth Mackinlay, Pamela Bernard, David Rousel, and Tatiana Dragovic, and co-authored with Elizabeth Mackinlay, Renee Mickelberg, and Mel Green of Writing Radically as Women with Virginia Woolf. Why? Published in Qualitative Inquiry in 2021. The second collaborator on this paper is Elizabeth, who goes by Liz Mackinlay, who is a professor in the Faculty of Education at the Southern Cross University and honorary academic in the School of Education at the University of Queensland. She is in love with words, and her most recent books, Critical Writing for Embodied Approaches, Autoethnography, Feminism, and Decoloniality, published by Palgrave in 2019, and Writing Feminist Autoethnography, In Love with Theory, Words, and the Language of Women Writers, with Routledge in 2022, are expressions of this passion for writing with an ethical sense and responsibility. So we'll start with the first panelist, and then I will introduce each speaker before their paper. So welcome, everybody, and thanks very much.
Thank you, Claire, and thanks everyone for being here. We hope you've had a great first day at the conference. We're coming to you from Brisbane in Australia, and as is the custom here, we would like to begin our presentation by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands upon which we meet. We're sitting on Yagara and Turrbal country and acknowledge that this always was and always will be Yagara and Turrbal land, and we pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, as well as any other First Nations peoples who are joining us today. Could She See Her? The Ethics of Writing Feminist Autoethnography with Virginia Woolf. This is how it all came about. 3 of us were sitting around one day after lunch at Merlot's Cafe on campus.
Liz stared up at the grotesque statue of Frida Beige, her hands gripping a steering wheel and sweetly smiling, and wondered how Frida would see women in education today. The engines we motor, what she might think of the dented and dusty body that Liz herself was driving.
Karen had rotated the rearview mirror so that she could take better note of herself, noting the things that were happening around her. And Virginia was occupied in building little towers of sugar upon the edge of the tea tray.
We sat silently, awash with the felt sense that this present meant something. Something about writing autoethnography, something about writing as women, and yet the ripples of connection between these two somethings remained unseen.
Then Liz said, "Do you see the writing that is done in this institution?" Then Virginia said, "I can only see my writing, but not how I feel about it or what it is I'm seeking. Have I the power of conveying the true reality, or do I write essays about myself?"
And then Karen said, "Well, you have always said, Virginia, that is indeed a problem. How a writer is to find the right relationship between the self that you know and the world outside." And Virginia said, "A writer, after all, is never alone. There's always a public with her." And I'm not sure anyone has altogether solved how to see the two as one.
And Liz said, "The relational practice of autoethnography." And Virginia said, "Cheeky little vagabond of a word." And Liz said, "I hope so. Autoethnography is audacious, but wisely so, as the personal and the social are reflexively brought together through evocative written accounts to see, make sense of, and challenge life as it is, and as it might be lived."
And then Karen said, "It is settled then. Before we bring any more words into this world, we need to find out what we mean when we use the word see and all of her derivatives to write the self and the social." And then Virginia said, "I have to agree. There's no trifling with words, not when they are to stand together." Then Karen said, "Let's make ourselves into a society for asking questions about seeing."
And Liz said, "Our questions should be directed to your writing, Virginia, those works where seeing selves and others seem to mingle amidst your heart, body and brain to light the lamp in your spine." And Virginia said, "So you, Liz, you must begin following this word see and all of her companions around in a room of one's own."
And Karen said, "And I shall see if I can see her and Mrs. Dalloway to think out writing and the self and the social more thoroughly." And Virginia said, "And we vow solemnly that we will not write a single word until we are satisfied that we have seen."
A violent thrill ran through us, a charge of electricity, which moved us to cry out together, affirming, "Yes, yes." Off we went then, with our notebooks and our pencils in the pursuit of truth.
Liz went to see what seems to be in a room of one's own.
Karen to Mrs. Dalloway, and with a final glance at Frida Beige,
Virginia climbed into her motor car and drove to Monk's house in Sussex to see if she might see her in the delicious society of her own body.
I first encountered a room of one's own, searching for myself as a woman in the academy, roaming the streets of Bloomington, Indiana. This time, I hold these words with autoethnographic hands, tasked with seeing Virginia Woolf as self-social and social self-writer. Then and now, she seems to embrace and embody autoethnographic sensibilities, but I wonder, and I decide to follow this method. My mind wanders to the word seem itself. Following Virginia's lead to think of words as sentient beings alive in the world, seem has been with us since the 12th century. She has moved through several meanings from seed to make one before coming to rest on seem, that is, to appear to be perceived as. Where is she then? Who is seem, and how does she behave in the world as a word? Her definitions seem to position her as outward-looking, gazing through the self to the social to ascertain how things are at any given moment. And I begin searching for her appearance like this in a room of one's own. I do not have to wait long before I alight upon her. There she is, right on the very first page, looking at the words women and fiction, and deciding that at second sight the words seemed not so simple, yet the most interesting, when spun round together in the social context of female writers. She soon appears again, strolling the grounds of Oxbridge, and upon passing by the chapel door, notices that the way Christianity sounds in the air seemed to crease, crush, and control people into singular shapes. She continues walking and reflects that the university seemed to function as a sanctuary for some, gold-plated, garnished with sumptuous sauces and salads, as she hears beadles proclaim how good life is. Then a Manx cat without a tail waltzes through across the quadrangle, and she noticed that something seemed to be lacking in this social movement. She takes herself to Fernham College, where being served beef, prunes and custard on plain china for dinner seemed to beg the question, why did men drink wine and women water? On cue, gate after gate seemed to close behind her, and she finds herself thinking how unpleasant it is to be locked out, and yet how it is perhaps worse to be locked in. My eyes lift from the page, distracted by a shadow that seemed to lie across it. For a moment, I imagined it was a woman, a figure representative of so many female colleagues whose bodies had been expunged from academic institutions because they were unprepared, unprepared, and unable to breathe amidst the flames of neoliberal patriarchy as they flickered at their feet. Virginia Woolf was writing about the exclusions of women from patriarchal institutions so long ago, and yet it seems to me that a room of one's own is as much an autoethnography of the past as it is of the present. Virginia Woolf steps outside of herself to listen to her friend and fellow student Mary Seaton, a woman whose stories of experience about the underfunding of women's education and the struggle to secure fellowships, scholarships and prizes to enable women's engagement in higher education remains all too real. The 2020 results for the Australian Research Council funded grants at my university indicate that not one woman applied for funding in this favourable scheme as a chief investigator, not a single one. And of those who applied in the lesser role of lead investigator, the success rate was only 8%. I am not sure why I am surprised. At a recent gender equity meeting, I watched it as the contemporary versions of Professors Von X and Y joked and laughed from one another. From one to the other. Well, my boy, if you have any women's and gender equity projects you need funding for, I would be happy to hear from you. Nod, nod, wink, wink. The same invitation was not extended to the women in attendance. None of us said anything. Maybe it was because we had just been told that even if it was bloody time to put menopausal and menstrual leave on the agenda, we, the university, needed to be careful because just like the domestic violence leave clause in our enterprise bargaining agreement, every woman would be asking for it. Or we could look to Virginia's Mary Beaton, an aunt whose legacy of £500 a year forever makes it possible for women to claim a room of their own with a lock on their door in which to write. As a professor in the university, I occupy an enormously privileged econo-epistemological position which stands alongside the power I hold as vice-admiral colonial, and my name on the door to my office and my fortnightly paycheck attests to this. But I am one in a rare species. Only 35% of women in Australia occupy this level of seniority in universities, and there are 86% more men than women at associate professor and professor level. The numbers on non-white women are even more telling in relation to who has and hangs on to authority and power in higher education. He is mostly male, white and grey. Processes, promotions, pedagogies and paradigms are placed within their control, and performing otherwise is to place yourself in precarity. Virginia shares with us what happens to the prose of Mary Carmichael when she tries to play along with the conventions of writing laid down by patriarchy. It seemed as though her sentences were torn and scratched in imitation, as though she were afraid of being called sentimental if she wrote as herself. I'm not sure whether to laugh or cry at this point, for a recent review of work that Karen and I had submitted for publication, a series of letters shared between us, composed in Woolfian style, which attempted to embody a strong feminist aesthetic, relational and effective presence, decried our prose as sloppy creative academic work, flowery hyperbolic. There was nothing, the reviewer declared, remotely interesting about eavesdropping as a reader on long and repeated declarations of mutual love in decorative language through a fake exchange of letters. The flagging of marginalised perspectives, such as those of straight and white religious men, they said. Now, that would be so much more engaging. And so, with hard brain and body still smarting, I turned to Virginia's fictional character, Judith, Shakespeare's sister. Like her brother, Judith was extraordinarily gifted and just as adventurous, as imaginative and agog to see the world. But unlike her brother, she was never sent to school. Each time she tries to step outside the confines of her life, she is reined back in and told to mend the stockings, mind the stew, not to moon about over books and papers, and is eventually tethered to be married. Judith cannot bear this thought, and together we run away to my hometown of Melbourne in pursuit of an academic life. Laughing and languishing in the intellectual love of her autoethnographic friends, she calls home every day to speak with her children, but says nothing when her husband answers the phone and chides her for leaving him alone with them. Selfish bitch, she screams down the line, and not knowing what else to do, she picks up her own. One winter's night, she wraps the hairdryer electrical cord around her neck and a hook protruding from the wall, and steps away from it all.
Back at my desk, I diligently pored over the pages of Mrs. Dalloway, and must confess, I saw so many references to seeing that I was almost struck blind. Virginia, you begin simply enough. Mrs. Dalloway is walking the streets of London as she sets out to buy the flowers herself. I found myself on the street, trying to catch a glimpse of the face of greatness seated within the passing motor car. There I stood with Retzia as she hoped no one would see the torturing Septimus. There I stood with Mole Pratt with her flowers on the pavement as she did not see the constable looking discouragingly upon her. There I stood with little Mr. Bowley as he was moved to tears upon seeing the poor women, nice little children, orphans, war widows, waiting to see the Queen go past. All of this seeing, waiting to see, hoping no one will see, being moved to tears by seeing, and then before I could think about what all this seeing might mean, everyone looked up. Look, look, Septimus, Retzia cried, take an interest in things outside of yourself. Look, she implored him. She was always interrupting. Look, she repeated, take notice of real things. Oh, look, she implored him again and again. But what was there to look at? A few sheep, that was all. Retzia then turned her attention to me and followed me to work. Look, look, Karen, she cried, for her focus was on operational matters. Look, she implored me, risk assessments need to be completed at least 2 weeks before the event. Look, she repeated, for the school board had said to analyse the data to determine what had gone wrong. Oh, look, she implored again and again. But what was there for me to spend my time looking at? A few policies and procedures, that was all. Then, just when I thought I had seen all the seeing, I returned to the streets of London on my walk with Clarissa to the moment when she was overcome by the oddest sense of being herself invisible, unseen, unknown. How does it happen, I asked her. How did Karen become invisible in this being Ms. Madden, leader in a girls' school? For having worked in the school, how many years now? Almost 20? One feels, even in the midst of the morning school traffic, walking the playground, a particular hush or solemnity, an indescribable pause, a suspense before the starting bell rings out. There, out it booms. Such fools we are, Clarissa and I think, approaching the stairs that lead to my office. For heaven only knows why one loves it so. The regularity of the school bell, the demand to adhere to a calendar fixed with early morning briefings, late evening concerts, weekend extracurricular activities, this being Ms. Madden, hidden, protected within the routines of school life, myself invisible, unseen, unknown, not Karen anymore, this being Ms. Madden, a dean in a girls' school. And then, not finished with me yet, Mrs. Dalloway begins to glare fixedly on this word see. Clarissa is a keen observer. She rapidly moves between watching others, watching herself, and then watching the others, watching her watching. Hand in hand, Clarissa and I enter the attic, a pair of nuns in a moment of contemplation on the heart of life. And what do we see? That women must put off their rich apparel. They must disrobe. In a room where we had read late at night by candlelight, we disrobed and found we had disappointed. But whom had I disappointed? I thought, putting my suit away. Was it Karen I had left behind? For that moment we had seen an illumination, a match burning in a crocus, an inner meaning almost expressed. But the close withdrew, the hard softened. It was over, the moment.
Some 3 months later, Karen, Virginia and Liz came together once more at Merlot's Cafe on campus to discuss the results of their observations. Frida Beige was still motoring away, moving mountains of men out of her way and making it possible for women to get in and have their way. How glad they were to see one another again, they exclaimed, whereupon in turn they delivered their reports.
And Virginia said, "Tell me then, what nugget of pure truth did you wrap up about writing autoethnography and writing as women with me, Virginia Woolf?" And Karen said, "I don't think we shall ever find the grains of truth embedded in all this mass of paper we have collected." And Virginia said, "If we allow ourselves to dream, the submerged truth might rise to the top and sparkle, much like diamonds in the dust heap."
And Liz said, "In reading A Room of One's Own, I could not help but see that in adopting the procedure of turning around the perspective of several social selves, the three Marys and Shakespeare's sister Judith, there seems to be an ethical turn which seeks to get beyond," then Virginia said, "the cotton wool of daily life to moments of being." Then Liz said, "To moments of being as women, to really see each and every one of her in all of her situations. There is an ethical attention to being in relationality with her, a trope of autoethnography, which I think Carolyn Ellis and James Selbo quite like. You are the collective self of all four women in A Room of One's Own, Virginia, and as women situated in society, they are individually you, and you hold both mindfully, carefully, and heartfully in the crafting and constructing and construing of this versioning of women's lives."
And then Karen said, "And I have seen in Virginia's novels an ethical attention in the writing of her characters, ourselves and others, as radically unsimple, always multifarious, polyvalent and polydimensional, with singular yet shifting meanings." And Virginia said, "A little like Frida Beige. There they are, 1, 2, 3 and more, busying themselves by motoring along and noticing everything." And Karen said, "We as women who seek to write our way through, to and with the multiple truths about ourselves in autoethnography can turn towards Mrs. Dalloway. Virginia, I see you have written Clarissa as a collection of selves. A 50-year-old Mrs. Dalloway walking the streets of London, a young woman falling in love at Boughton, Elizabeth's mother, the hostess of a grand party, a woman seen by an old lady in the opposite window, and then finally we are presented with Clarissa in the words of those who had loved her. It is Clarissa, they said, for there she was."
And then Liz said, "Yes, nothing is to be seen anymore except her as a collective of selves. In writing autoethnography, this is the relational ethic we embody. We are summoning our solitary selves in social company, perfectly provided for, wrapped warmly in a rug, protected from wind and rain, in the season of writing our accounts."
We sat and looked once more at the riotous scribblings of truths we had made in our notebooks, fully aware that these were our opinions, and perhaps as fiction, likely to contain more truth than fact. Together and apart, we sensed a Rolls-Royce engine beginning to purr in our brains, our creativity and criticality for writing autoethnography ethically in relation as feminists now firing on all cylinders, and took it as our sign to leave. And so Virginia said, "Off with you. Your work is done. I dismiss you. Goodbye." And Karen said, "And so I am. I'm off to write my shifting selves into my thesis. Moi, Virginia. Moi, Liz."
Liz watched
Liz
as her
what?
two friends wandered off across the great court and faded into the distance. Feeling a familiar ripple of connection on her skin, she looked up at the grotesque of Frida Beige and wondered, could she see her? Thank you, everyone.
Wow, thank you so much. What a fabulous start. Thank you. Wonderful. So our next panelist today will be Julia Dalloway, who is a DPhil candidate in English at the University of Oxford, where she researches the essay as a non-narrative form of life writing, a project that was first inspired by reading Virginia Woolf. She holds an MSc in Modern Literature from the University of Edinburgh, where she was also on the judging panel for the James Tate Black Prize for Biography. Welcome, Julia.
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm just going to upload an access copy of my paper in case anyone wants to follow along. So forgive me if that takes a second.
Take your time, and I'll just take a moment to say that I'm sending a hopefully discreet message in the chat to panelists when you're just coming up to time. So just to expect that for both of you.
Okay, hopefully it's come through.
Perfect, thank you, Julia.
So this paper is titled Floating Incidents, The Ethics of Essayistic Life Writing in Woolf's A Sketch of the Past. Woolf's unfinished memoir, A Sketch of the Past, is rarely included in critical discussions of Woolf's essays and essayistic techniques. One major study by Randy Salomon, entitled Virginia Woolf's Essayism, is instead preoccupied with the ways in which Woolf's novels incorporate such techniques. While Elena Galtieri's study of Woolf's essays does address A Sketch of the Past, Galtieri deems it a, quote, unclassifiable text, and suggests that its inclusion within her study indicates the, quote, extreme flexibility of the essay form. In terms of genre, A Sketch of the Past clearly falls within the category of memoir, but in terms of form, I propose it should be classified as an extended essay, or at least as essayistic. In fact, the term a sketch, which Woolf herself applies to this text, bears some similarity to the etymological roots of the essay form. Critics often trace the word essay, first used to describe a literary form by Michel de Montaigne in the 17th century, back to the French verb essayer, meaning to attempt, which implies a certain tentativeness and provisionality comparable to that of a sketch. In 1958, Theodore Adorno further defines the essay form, noting its emphasis on what is particular as opposed to universal, and what is fragmentary as opposed to complete. Most importantly, in the context of this paper, Adorno observes associative thinking as another key trait. Rather than following established logical pathways, the essay, to quote Adorno, freely associates what can be found in the freely chosen object. All of these qualities of the essay can be found in Woolf's autobiographical sketch. Heightened critical interest in both the essay and life writing as separate areas of study is indicated by the recent publication of edited collections, such as Thomas Carshan and Catherine Murphy's On Essays in 2020, and Zachary Leader's On Life Writing in 2017. Yet the essay as a life writing form has been overlooked. For instance, there is no entry regarding the essay in Margaretta Jolly's otherwise comprehensive Encyclopedia of Life Writing. Within the small body of existing scholarship on life writing essays, Marie O'Rourke highlights the concord between the essay form and life writing content as, quote, rich ground for further examination. This paper will seek to follow O'Rourke's suggestion through an analysis of Woolf as a life writing essayist. Contemporary theorists from history, biography, and philosophy have voiced concerns about our widespread use of narrative form to represent people's real life experiences, particularly narrative that displays a single linear thread. The historiographer Hayden White questions, does the world really present itself to perception in the form of well-made stories, with central subjects, proper beginnings, middles, and ends, and a coherence that permits us to see the end in every beginning? He suggests that the shape and structure we conventionally expect from a life narrative is necessarily a false imposition. Philosopher Galen Strawson undercuts what he deems the oppressive consensus that people universally, quote, experience their lives as a narrative or story of some sort. He instead proposes a distinction between people who are narrative and those who are non-narrative. Strawson explicitly positions Virginia Woolf, among others, in the non-narrative camp and claims that, quote, for most of us, self-knowledge comes best in bits and pieces. Memory, as well as experience, does not inherently take narrative form. As Barbara Herstein-Smith writes, our knowledge of past events is usually not narrative in structure or given in story-like sequences, but rather in the form of general and imprecise recollections, scattered and possibly inconsistent pieces of verbal information, and various visual, auditory, and kinesthetic images. Collectively, these theorists highlight the inadequacies of linear narrative form in representing human lives, due to both the complexity of experience and the fragmentariness of memory. These concerns about narrative also have an ethical dimension. Taking a narrative approach to real experiences and memories may be considered ethically dubious in light of how, as Strawson warns, such an approach encourages us to engage in, quote, invention, falsification, confabulation. Accurate depiction of reality certainly matters to Woolf. Her literary critical essays frequently highlight her ambition to create realism in fiction, to capture what she calls life or spirit, truth or reality, this, the essential thing. Yet her understanding of realism is vastly different from the realism associated with her Victorian and Edwardian literary predecessors. In her 1925 essay, Modern Fiction, Woolf criticizes the Edwardian supposedly realist style as ironically unrealistic. By contrast, she praises the upcoming generation of modernist writers, including James Joyce, who, quote, attempt to come closer to life, even if to do so they must discard most of the conventions which are commonly observed by the novelist. One convention Woolf mentions is the imperative for writers to provide a plot, that is, the sequence of events that traditionally takes the form of a coherent narrative. Woolf asks rhetorically, is life like this? Must novels be like this? If such worries apply to novels, surely they apply to life writing to an even greater degree, as life writing alleges to have an even closer mimetic relation to life. It is in light of these ethical qualms about narrative life writing that the essay form reveals its distinctive potential. The essay has historically been distanced from narrative. A 1942 anthology of essays defines the form as, quote, a piece of prose, usually on the short side, which is not devoted to narrative. Of all the essay's characteristic traits, association, especially, provides the essay with a structural alternative to narrative. Leslie Jameson reads contemporary essayists as working within a collage mode, which involves, quote, implicitly insisting on associative glue as a substitute for narrative spine. While narrative involves temporal and causal links between events, associative thinking frees writers to dance between memories. An associative essay structure is thus uniquely suited to represent memory, which naturally comes in associative fragments. Having undercut literary conventions in her modern fiction essay, Woolf then offers her famous injunction, let us record the atoms as they fall upon the mind in the order in which they fall. Let us trace the pattern, however disconnected and incoherent in appearance, which each sight or incident scores upon the consciousness. Woolf's call for minute attention, as exemplified by her metaphor of atoms, is reinforced by further imperatives such as, quote, look within and examine for a moment. Critics usually interpret modern fiction in relation to Woolf's use of the stream of consciousness mode in her novels, but the act of recording the atoms as they fall upon the mind also mirrors an essayist's tendency to follow mental trains of association. I suggest that Woolf's understanding of realism and its relation to attention can be illuminated by a comparison with 20th century ethical philosopher Iris Murdoch. Murdoch defines realism as ability to perceive reality and sees it as an ethical necessity. For Murdoch, such realism is achieved through attention, which should be directed, quote, outwards, away from the self which reduces all to a false unity, towards the great surprising variety of the world. Woolf would agree with Murdoch that attention allows room for complexity. She believes, for example, that a faithful novelist of reality would record, quote, whatever aberration or complexity it may display. Woolf's response to overly simplistic so-called realist conventions is to pay closer attention to reality, in this case, the real associative structure of memory. It may seem that Woolf differs from Murdoch in the direction of her attention. While Murdoch encourages us to move away from the self, Woolf, on the contrary, encourages us to look within to find a complexity that undercuts literary conventions, namely the, quote, astonishing disorder of our inner lives. However, this distinction should not be overstated. Woolf's acts of attention are not exclusively or ultimately introspective, because, as we shall see, following her own mental pathways leads her to disregard self-centered narratives and attend instead to external environments. I will now explore precisely how the associative movements of the essay form permit Woolf to challenge the narrative conventions of memoir. Graham Good recognizes that, unlike conventional book-length autobiography, quote, the autobiographical essay shows a persistent tendency to organize memory in terms of place rather than time. Indeed, in Woolf's A Sketch of the Past, memories are not situated along a timeline, but instead clustered around geographical locations. Two key places feature repeatedly: St Ives in Cornwall, where Woolf spent her childhood summers, and London, where she spent the rest of the year. St Ives particularly serves the function of scrambling chronology. When Woolf edges towards chronological narration of St Ives by writing of her, quote, next memory, she corrects herself, quote, all these colour and sound memories hang together at St Ives. Using place as a textual centre of gravity evidently engenders new formal possibilities for life writing, beyond the constraints of linear narrative time. Woolf also describes her St Ives memories as, quote, an incongruous miscellaneous catalogue, little corks that mark a sunken net. And of London, she writes, quote, I could collect a great many more floating incidents, scenes in Kensington Gardens. The idea of floating features explicitly in her image of London's floating incidents, and implicitly in that of St Ives's corks that mark a sunken net, in both cases suggesting disconnection between individual memories, although the net suggests there may be a hidden pattern. What draws her memories together is their shared association with a particular place, a way of compiling memories that does not involve chronology, but rather essayistic associative movements. Even Woolf's most significant memories in A Sketch of the Past, the intense and formative experiences she terms moments of being, she situates spatially, not temporally. After explaining her theory of these moments, Woolf offers three personal examples: a pacifist realization, a mystical perception of a flowerbed, and a sense of horror regarding a visitor's suicide. Upon close reading, it becomes clear that each of these examples takes place in the Tullen House garden. The first instance occurs when, quote, fighting with her brother Toby on the lawn, and the location of this lawn becomes evident when she links this memory to the following one with the phrase, the second instance was also in the garden at St Ives. Her third memory, we are told, is, quote, also at St Ives, and its central realization takes place, quote, in the garden at night. Associative connections based on a common geographical location thus provide the link between one memory and another. By contrast, Woolf does not attempt to recall the chronological order of these moments. Indeed, throughout the memoir, she displays ambivalence about chronology. For example, she mentions her first memory alongside her, quote, other memory, which also seems to be my first memory. Her memories of Kensington Gardens likewise come in clusters. Again, those moments of being, she writes, two I always remember. Woolf tends to retrieve multiple memories at once and to present them laterally. Thomas Carr-Shan traces the essay's associative quality back to John Locke's philosophy of the association of ideas. In 1690, Locke himself describes how, quote, ideas that have no kinship in themselves come to be so strongly linked in some men's minds that it is very hard to separate them. Locke's acknowledgement that even unexpected associative pairings can be strongly linked in our minds ensures that we do not conflate such pairings with randomness or chaos. I earlier quoted Woolf's call to trace the pattern, however disconnected and incoherent in appearance. Woolf, I argue, is in search of patterns within her mental networks of memory, although these patterns may not be conscious or obvious. Woolf describes her, quote, philosophy, that behind the cotton wool of everyday life is hidden a pattern. And in her diary, she envisages her ideal memoir in terms of patterning. Quote, a real life must lack center. All the same, I can weave a very thick pattern one of these days out of that pattern of detail. Sven Birkitz asserts that the memoirist writes, above all else, to redeem experience, to reawaken the past, and to find its pattern. Better yet, he writes to discover behind bygone events a dramatic explanatory narrative. Only the first half of this claim holds true for Woolf. She is not seeking an explanatory narrative, but rather patterns for their own sake, letting the reader draw their own conclusions. To sum up, Woolf, like Murdoch, recognizes the ethical importance of seeing reality as it really is, an ethical principle that has particular relevance to life writing. For both thinkers, the practice of attention is essential to such realism, although they differ, at least superficially, regarding the direction they believe our attention should take. While Murdoch sees the self as a false unity compared to the surprising variety of the external world, Woolf sees a comparable, astonishing disorder within human inner lives. However, my textual analysis of Woolf's use of place to structure her memoir has suggested that her ethical framework is not so different from Murdoch's after all. Attention to the inner life leads Woolf to discover how memory is structured associatively, not narratively, and attention to this associative structure leads her to focus on the external geographical locations around which her memories cluster. In other words, attention to the inner life ultimately, and paradoxically, encourages attention to the outer world. Most importantly, the associative structure of the essay form offers Woolf a more realistic and therefore more ethical alternative to narrative life writing. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Julia. Fabulous. So now I'm going to share in the chat an access copy of the next paper. So hopefully everyone can see that. So it's my great pleasure now to introduce Pamela Kahi, who is a professor of English and Women's Studies and Gender Studies at Loyola University in Chicago. Former president of the Modernist Studies Association, Professor Caughie is a feminist and gender theorist whose research and teaching focus on modernist and postmodernist literatures and culture. Over the past decade, she has become increasingly involved in the digital humanities, serving as co-editor of Woolf Online, an amazing resource, co-director of the Modernist Networks, and project director for the Lily Ilb Digital Archive, a companion to her most recent book publication, Man into Woman, a comparative scholarly edition, co-edited with Sabine Meyer. Professor Caughie has edited 3 additional works and is author of 2 monographs, Virginia Woolf and Postmodernism, 1991, and Passing in Pedagogy, The Dynamics of Responsibility in 1999, and nearly 4 dozen articles and book chapters. So welcome, Pamela. I'm going to quickly share your slides for you. So just give me a second.
Not yet, not until
Okay.
I get to page 5.
Gotcha, okay.
I'll let you know. I don't have a cover screen. Thank you,
Perfect,
Claire.
sounds great.
So full disclosure, I presented this paper on the Virginia Woolf Society panel at the Louisville conference in 2006. I asked Amy if she would like me to reprise the paper for this conference, assuming few here had heard it, and even those who had would likely not remember a word I said. She agreed. So here we are. I'm curious to know how the argument holds up. A commonly held view of narrative ethics assumes that stories give us versions of real-life events so that we can exercise our moral judgment, hone our skills in making ethical and just decisions. This view holds that we learn to make ethical judgments by learning to empathize with others' experiences, as these are reflected in literature. We put ourselves in their place and thereby come to expand our notion of what it means to be human. Ethics lies in being able to bridge the gap between our position and theirs. In Passing in Pedagogy, the Dynamics of Responsibility, I suggested we rethink this common notion of ethics in order to rethink where ethics takes place in the study of literature. Woolf's writing provides a different model for narrative ethics, and ethics without identification. What they teach us is not how to read characters as if they were people, but how to read people as if they were texts. Woolf relocates ethics in the material practices of reading and writing, and thus textual analysis becomes an ethical imperative. The ethical questions, what shall I do? How should I respond? Become in Woolf's writings, how should one read a book or another? Most famously in Jacob's Room, but also elsewhere in Woolf's writings, characters are presented as stories, books, quote, whose pages we turn over and over as if we should at last find what we look for. Though, of course, we never do. We don't find Jacob at the end of the novel. We don't find the nugget of pure truth at the end of A Room of One's Own, or the meaning of Latrobe's play at the end of Between the Acts. Woolf's as if we should find what we look for, turns the act of reading for truth or insight into character into a metaphor, a figure, a fiction. Woolf's writing across identity boundaries resists identification, even risks sounding unsympathetic, and yet presents an engaged ethics that can serve as a model for contemporary concerns about reading and judging other people or cultures. As an example of how different views of narrative lead to different understanding of ethics and justice, in the original version of this paper, I used the change to the rape policy at Harvard University, instituted in 2002. That new policy required corroborating evidence, such as a witness to the crime, before any disciplinary hearings would take place. This change was touted as the end of he said, she said justice, where we are forced to choose between two conflicting accounts without anything to measure them against, no standard for determining what really happened. He said, she said justice, supporters of the new policy claim, often turns on false accusations and ends in unjust disciplinary action. But unjust to whom? The paradigm of he said, she said justice reduces a systemic problem to a personal dispute. As one commentator on the Johnny Depp Amber Heard trial put it, we should know by now that the symmetry implied by that phrase is an ideological fiction. Cases of sexual assault do not fit our traditional standards for determining whether harm was done. Instead, they raise questions about how harm is defined, by whom, and at whose expense. It is those questions that go begging in a policy that forbids any hearing unless there's proof. For hearings are the means for establishing the legitimacy of the competing accounts by interrogating the normative standards by which claims of legitimacy are established. And that requires learning to read people the way many of us have learned to read text, taking into account the discursive structures, the narrative conventions, the character assignments, and the social context within which the stories operate. It is this insight I gain as much from reading Virginia Woolf as from reading, say, Judith Butler or Jacques Derrida. For in an essay like Mr. Bennet and Mrs. Brown, A Defense of Character in Jacob's Room, Woolf essentially argues that what is true about a character is what is accepted as being true within the terms of a given discourse. In using Mrs. Brown to illustrate the change in conception of character in fiction that occurred circa December 1910, Woolf shows that the old view of character comes from a certain type of narrative. For the Edwardians, like Arnold Bennett, character had to do with the fabric of life, with houses, clothing, families, property. It was fixed, bounded, empirical. For modernists like Woolf, a character is not lifelike in this way. Rather, a character is one who makes us see things through its eyes, she writes. Woolf's essay is less a narrative about a poor old lady named Mrs. Brown than it is a critique of reality as we have learned to see it through certain social and literary conventions. Sounding a lot like Derrida, Woolf in this essay admires writers for whom, quote, everything was inside the book, nothing outside. The modernist formalist aesthetics par excellence. And that difference makes all the difference when it comes to ethical prose. Arnold Bennett argues that characters must be real for novels to succeed. Woolf responds by asking, who are the judges of reality? In Jacob's Room, often considered her first experimental novel, Woolf draws attention to the many types of narrative discourse that structure Jacob as a character, which analogously suggests the many types of discourse that construct our relation to others and to reality, truth, and justice. Jacob seems to lack an identity to elude our grasp, not because the self is unknowable, but because the narrative discourse changes. As I note in Virginia Woolf and postmodernism, sometimes the narrator sounds like Jane Austen. Elizabeth Flanders was, of course, a widow in her prime. Sometimes she sounds like a biographer. Jacob Flanders, therefore, went up to Cambridge in October 1906. Sometimes she speaks directly to the reader, as in a Thackeray novel. Let us consider Letters. And most often, she becomes a character in her own story, as in a metafictional novel. The narrator sits on the train with Mrs. Brown. In Jacob's Room, she makes explicit her position in relation to Jacob. Whether we know what was in his mind is another question. Granted 10 years seniority and a difference of sex, fear of him comes first. These shifts in narrative discourse create a pervasive uncertainty in the novel, a narrative uncertainty often interpreted as Woolf's belief that we can never know another. But the emphasis on the shifting narrative discourse and points of view in this novel shows that knowledge of another is bound up with narrative relations. As Woolf writes in Mr. Bennet and Mrs. Brown, character in fiction has changed because narrative and social relations have changed. The cook now pops into the drawing room to borrow the daily paper. How do we write and read across shifting identity boundaries? Explicitly in Jacob's Room and implicitly in Mr. Bennet and Mrs. Brown, Woolf explores the effect of social changes on the structure of experience and on new formations of the subject. You could call up my first slide now, Claire, please. For example, in a passage in Jacob's Room describing the multitudes of people around St. Paul, where Jacob is playing tourist, the narrator writes, "Nothing could appear more certain from the steps of St. Paul's than that each person is miraculously provided with coat, skirt, and boots, an income, and object. They have no houses. The streets belong to them, the shops, the churches. Theirs the innumerable desks, the stretched office lights, the vans are theirs, and the railway slung high above the street. If you look closer, you will see that 3 elderly men at a little distance from each other run spiders along the pavement as if the street were their parlor. They have no houses, not because they are literally homeless, but because the urban scene is the only place where we confront these modern subjects, the multitudes. They can't be identified by their houses like Arnold Bennett's Hilda Lessways, for we know them only in their urban setting. We need a new narrative for this experience." Now let me contrast Woolf's address to the reader in this passage, if you look closer, with a similar command by a 19th century author of social change, namely Rebecca Harding Davis. In Life in the Iron Mills, the narrator cautions the reader not to judge her character too quickly. The second slide, Claire, please. I want you to come down and look at this wolf, Hugh Wolf, not Virginia, standing there among the lowest of his kind, and see him just as he is, that you may judge him justly when you hear the story of this night. I want you to look back as he does every day at his birth in vice, his starved infancy, to remember the heavy years he has groped through as boy and man, the slow, heavy years of constant hot work. That is the ethics of identification. Reading the life stories of others will give you knowledge and sympathy so that you can judge justly. Woolf's, if you look closer, implies no such moral address to the reader. In its movement from distance to close-up, the narrative perspective is more like a camera. And as Walter Benjamin writes in The Work of Art, a different nature opens itself to the camera than opens to the naked eye, if only because an unconsciously penetrated space is substituted for a space consciously explored, or in this case, self-consciously explored, as Woolf draws attention to narrative perspective and to the need for new narrative relations and response to new social relations. Woolf's effort to write across boundaries of identity, especially class boundaries, which I want to turn to now, calls for a self-conscious narrative practice that doesn't assume one can identify with another and that draws attention to the situatedness of the narrator. I want to look at how Woolf does this in her introductory letter to Life as We Have Known It, a collection of memoirs by working class women edited by her friend Margaret Llewellyn Davies. Woolf's language in this letter is highly equivocal, conveying the discomfort Woolf felt writing about these memoirs and exposing her own class position. Writing about the speeches she heard at a guild conference 20 years earlier, Woolf contrasts two types of sympathy, real and aesthetic. The next slide, Claire, just stop with the, thank you. Woolf says, excuse me, real sympathy, Woolf says, comes from sharing the same emotions that come from experiencing the same material conditions. Real sympathy is not available to her. After all, the imagination is largely a child of the flesh, she writes. The first quote, please, Claire. One could not be Mrs. Giles of Durham because one's body had never stood at the washtub. Now, a social investigator such as Marie Van Voorst, on the other hand, can experience real sympathy because she passes as a working class girl and stands at the assembly line. Thus, she has real sympathy. The next quote, please. Born into dirt and ugliness, disfigured by effort, they have the same heritage as we, joys and sorrows, grief and laughter. This is the ethics of identification. Instead, Woolf is limited to aesthetic sympathy. The next slide, please, which comes from reading the life stories of others. Aesthetic implies detachment, not identification. Woolf's sympathy with these women, she says, was the sympathy of the eye and of the imagination, not of the heart and of the nerves. And such sympathy is always physically uncomfortable. Perhaps to quell the discomfort aroused by aesthetic sympathy, Woolf constantly reminds the reader of her difference in class from these guild women. First quote, please. If every reform they demand was granted this very instant, it would not touch one hair of my comfortable capitalistic head. Hence, my interest is merely altruistic. There is no lifeblood or urgency about it. However hard I clap my hands or stamp my feet, there is a hollowness in the sound which betrays me. I am a benevolent spectator. I am irretrievably cut off from the actors. I sit here hypocritically clapping and stamping, and outclassed from the flock. It is this outsider status that limits her to aesthetic sympathy rather than real sympathy. Next quote, please. To begin with, all their talk, we said, or the greater part of it, was matters of fact. They want baths and money. To expect us, whose minds fly free at the end of a short length of capital, to tie ourselves down again to that narrow plot of acquisitiveness and desire is impossible. We have baths and we have money. Therefore, however much we had sympathized, our sympathy was largely factitious. In emphasizing her difference and distance from these women by minding the gap between them, Woolf models a way of writing across class boundaries that doesn't depend on identification or real sympathy, but instead exposes the discrepancy between what the writer professes, sympathy, solidarity, and how the writer is positioned, leisure class. The word again in that passage reminds us that Woolf was not always free from such acquisitiveness. Again signifies a class identification more real than any sympathetic identification with these working class women. Woolf finds the class barrier, she says, impassable in real life, but she wants to believe that these memoirs may go a long way toward closing that gap, helping her as a writer to imagine the inner life of the working class woman. Still, reading these memoirs for the experience alone isn't very satisfying. As a critic, Woolf feels compelled to acknowledge the writing, which alas is not good. Her aesthetic sympathy does not extend to the aesthetics of these texts. Slide, please, Claire. As literature, they have many limitations, she says. The writing lacks detachment and imaginative breadth. There is no view of life as a whole and no attempt to enter the lives of other people. They write with difficulty, finding few words, and those awkwardly. When it comes to sympathizing across class lines, literature isn't, after all, enough. The discrepancy between what she professes and how she's positioned accounts for the anxiety and ambivalence generated by writing and reading across class lines. Woolf's discomfort renders her inarticulate. She hastily concludes her introduction in mid-sentence. Yet that very failure of language tells us more about class relations than any pronouncement she could make about the working classes. For her discomfort brings to the fore the material and discursive structures that inform our identifications across class boundaries, our different material and aesthetic interests. In other words, the ethical response lies not in what Woolf says, but rather in the performance of identity and identification in the writing itself. According to Virginia Woolf and the Ethics of Intimacy, Elsa Hallberg's compelling account of the ethics of Woolf's aesthetics, to see the other as distinct from oneself, as Woolf's notion of aesthetic sympathy would seem to do, is to engage in a sort of ethical violence. Yet Hallberg also opposes intimacy achieved through Woolf's modernist writing of interiority to empathy or identification, so that Woolf's art itself becomes a means of resisting violence. We both locate Woolf's ethics in her narrative prose. Woolf's writing is ethical insofar as it is concerned with how we as readers and writers negotiate the gap between our subject position and the characters, and with whether and how we become answerable for the choices we make in writing and reading across identity boundaries. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Pamela, and thank you so much to all of our panelists. So now I would love to invite questions from the audience. If anyone has them, you can please feel free to put them in the chat or to speak up. We'd love to hear your voice and see your face if that's feasible for you. And while everybody is gathering their thoughts, I will start with a question, if that's all right. So I see many intersections between these papers, and so I'm hoping that we can start with one of the things that occurred to me throughout these presentations, which is this idea that there's almost a requirement for unconventional narration or strategies that sort of move away from linearity in order to actually express a kind of non-fictional ethical truth, right? So we're thinking about, Julia, in your paper, the idea of kind of the essay form needing to be manipulated in these various interesting ways. And then Karen and Liz, in your paper, you actually embodied a new and unconventional conference paper format, which I would love to talk a little bit more with you about. And then, of course, Pamela, you're talking about many different elements of this, but specifically also like narrative focalization, right, and different narrative shifts. And I wonder if we can kind of think about not only those kind of unconventional narrative requirements in Woolf's moment, but also how they might be playing out currently in discourse. So I was really intrigued go by your raising the kind of herd trial question. And then I know, Julia, you've worked on contemporary essayists as well. And then, of course, for the first panelists, you yourselves are using unconventional narration. So I wonder, I guess the question is, how can we take some of these urges towards the unconventional narrative strategy in nonfiction and apply them to our contemporary kind of situation and the way that we think about writing ethically in a nonfictional mode these days? So please feel free to jump in if there's anything in there that you'd like to talk about.
Well, maybe I'll just start by going back to a point I made early on about textual analysis being an ethical imperative, because I found and perhaps I should have skipped the Harvard rape policy and updated this to the Johnny Depp and Amber Heard trial, but we seem to be, by that editorial I quoted about he said, she said justice in relationship to the contemporary moment, shows us how much we haven't moved away from that paradigm. And I think that is one responsibility I feel as a teacher, is to move students away from their commonplace assumptions, like about why somebody is right or wrong, or where they're looking to find justice, and to get them to read it, to read people as if they were reading text. And so to me, it's less about just the unconventional form than the self-consciousness that draws attention to itself. So in that introductory letter to life as we have known it, you could read it and just say, oh God, this is awful. I mean, she really, doesn't sympathize with these women at all. How could she dare in this letter to talk about how bad their writing is? But there's also that what she's doing is exposing herself at every moment explicitly. And that to me is really important in understanding that ethical position, rather than trying to stand back like a Rebecca Harding Davis or to get totally involved like a Marie Van Voorst, but drawing attention to that writing. And that's what I think Julia's paper was bringing out too in Sketch of the Past, how self-conscious it is as a memoir essay. So I'll shut up.
No, that's great. Thank you, Pamela.
I also wanted to refer back to something in Pamela's paper about character and how there seems to be this shift in Woolf's modernism from a focus on character to a sort of focus on consciousness and actually entering into the consciousness of another person. And I'm wondering if there are certain ways in which, for me in my research on the essay form, there is this shift from a lot of contemporary writers who are writing their memoirs are wanting to do them in the form of an essay so that they can fully enter into their own sense of consciousness rather than having to portray characters of the other people in their lives. So yeah, I wonder if there's an interesting parallel there.
Karen and I, it's just thinking about the ethical writing terms a little bit differently. And I guess one of the ways that we're trying to engage with Virginia Woolf's work is to see the way that she is turning her writing ethically towards self and others, and bring those writing strategies into the field of autoethnography, which is all about writing the self as the social. And so the way that we're thinking about that is just ever so slightly differently, and thinking around the ways that Woolfian writing strategies are looking at the self and the social, and inform other types of non-fiction academic writing. Karen, is that a summary of what we're trying to do? Sorry about the airport noise.
You're doing very well, Liz. Yeah, so what Liz was just talking about there is feminist autoethnography. So autoethnography is about writing the self as the social. So it's not just autobiography, it's about, it's not just writing your story, but it's about, it's doing that in a way that's critical of what's happening on a societal level. Liz and I are feminist autoethnographers, so we find that the way that Woolf interrogates her own positioning, she seems to be aware that, I guess, of the authority of her voice when she's writing characters or herself and others, which is really central to our work, is that when you're a researcher, identifying that position of authority that you have necessarily as being the one who's choosing the words to tell the story. And so we find that when we read Woolf, we see that tension, that she grapples with that as well in a way that we find really helpful to our work.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I think this is a really rich line of discussion too, just in terms of thinking about, self-awareness, but also equivocation, right? That there's positioning, but that positioning always can shift. And so I think this is something that certainly I found really fruitful in the way that Woolf writes about her own position, is that she never really, she's trying to find it. That's always happening, right? But that it isn't a fixed position. And that's something that resonates really nicely, actually, in some ways. Like, I'm just thinking about this now based on what you're saying, Karen, with thinking about, for example, like positioning oneself now as a settler, for example, and thinking decolonially about teaching and things like this, that there is this kind of sense that positioning has an ethical weight, but also that you have to be aware of your own changing position as you move through life and as you change in the world, right? So there's something that instability kind of also comes through in Woolf's work as well.
Just to jump in, Claire, certainly that is a central trope of autoethnography. That's
right.
why autoethnographers, many of us, myself included, have turned away from ethnography, is for that very reason, is that we feel that positioning yourself within the context of your writing, your academic writing, is actually the only ethical way forward, so that we can somehow manage to think really deeply and carefully and relationally about selves and others, so that we're not perpetuating all the kinds of colonial violences and other things that are so much part of ethnographic work. So that's very much part of the ethical turn in autoethnography, is, or for myself particularly, is to be thinking around how can we do something different other than coloniality in our work as an ethical move.
Yeah, excellent. And I think, I do like that preface from Life as We Have Known It, like it's obviously it's received a lot of flack, fair enough. But at the same time, I kind of rereading it again through your paper, Pamela, it does look different to me now in a certain way, that there's that sort of raw honesty of it is actually, it does do some ethical work that is maybe different than a surface reading would sort of suggest, right? That where she first appears critical and snobbish, but actually there's something going on there about recognizing her own tendencies in that way and kind of positioning her place and understanding it, or trying to understand it, right? Like it is really interesting. It's a really, really complicated short text, isn't it, that preface?
It very much is, but again, it comes from whether we see, go back to the beginning of the paper, ethics is involving closing that gap or respecting that gap. So we could be read as indifferent or crass, unsympathetic, but only if you expect that gap to be closed. And I think what reading Woolf against some other writers who do practice the ethics of identification, I find that Woolf is more honest about it. There's an insincerity to me of reading these texts where it's like, I get it, I can identify. This is something I try to get students to do as well in reading cross boundaries of class or race or sexuality, is to recognize that their goal isn't to claim an identification that they can't perhaps inhabit.
Yeah, no, it's really important, isn't it? Beth, I see your hand, please. Nice to see you.
I was just going to add to Pamela's excellent paper and what she has just said about closing the gap or respecting the gap, and say that that's exactly what Woolf is doing in The Leaning Tower too. She's taking those poets to task for what I would call slumming, which is perhaps unfair, but for asserting a sympathy that she thinks they cannot possibly feel because, as you say, they have not been on a factory line or on the street cleaning up trash or, digging coal. They have not done that. So I think it's, I think class politics obviously is fraught for very many reasons, but I have the same reaction to Woolf. I'm just so impressed over and over again with her honesty. And if her position shifts, she lets you know that. And that's, as somebody who tries to write even critical papers, it's very difficult, I think, to be as honest as she often manages to be. And then we get to judge her. I mean, oh my goodness. She just lays herself out there, right? She just lays herself out there and takes the arrows. I have always thought that was amazing. So now I'll shut up. Thank you. Thank you, Pamela.
Well, thank you, Beth, for bringing up that late essay, The Leaning Tower. That's a really wonderful parallel to life as we have known it. A good example of that this isn't unique to that introductory letter. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, it's really, oh, I see a hand. I will go for that. Stella, please.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for those wonderful papers. I don't know if this is a fair question, but I'm going to try to pose it. The idea of kind of respecting the gap between yourself and a person who is very differently situated, or of trying to use various kind of narrative models to offer a variety of ways of approaching that different person. These kinds of models, do they have any usefulness when there is at hand a real ethical problem, such as the one that's posed in 3 Guineas? How do they apply at all? And if so, to what extent? Because that's a book, right, in which she really needs to do more than, either respect a gap or try to close it up. Does that question make any sense?
Yes, it does, Stella. I would say what I've written about 3 Guineas is to focus on the writing itself, the narrative form, as being crucial to the kind of argument that she's offering. So I'm not sure where you're seeing the gap she's trying to close, whether it would be between herself and the interlocutor, the letter writer that she first addressed, who wants her guinea. But I don't think she acknowledges, for example, the similarities with that gentleman writing to her when she says, we feel the same way looking at these photos, right, for example, but and that they have similar class positions. So she acknowledges that positioning first. And that's what I'm finding very important. But then she goes on, though, to bring in the gender difference. So that's where she's schooling us as readers in a way of approaching these questions that doesn't just jump in and say, here's my guinea, because, I agree 100%, this is horrible and we have to stop it. But she makes us go through the reasoning process with her. So I see there that she's doing something very
Right.
similar as to what she's doing in Leaning Tower or the Davy's introduction.
Right. Yeah, I agree when it comes to the way she carefully situates herself in relation to the various letter writers. I guess I was thinking in particular that, you know, this is a nonfiction document in which there is a real problem to be solved, or at least a solution to a very urgent problem to be proposed. And so it's a very different ethical project, right? To how do you move from that situatedness and that crossing of identification borders to proposing some kind of a solution to a really urgent problem, which I don't expect you to answer, but
I'm letting others.
It's really interesting. I don't know, Julia, if you have any thoughts about that question, just in relation to sort of the genre aspect of it, right? That there's a certain kind of, there potentially is a genre difference between the reflective essay or the critical essay in that mode, and then the kind of polemic or I don't know if that, whatever way you want to describe it. So I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, Julia, but I'd be curious to know.
Yeah, I was just thinking about what Theodore Adorno wrote about the essay being a radically unradical form because it refrains from reduction to any one principle. And I can see that in situations like Woolf was in and her society was in while writing Three Guineas, then maybe it's one situation where something that's radically unradical is not radical enough, if that makes sense. But in certain other contexts, like in a lot of Woolf's feminist writings, I feel that the idea of an essayistic writing style can allow for this complexity of human character, which a narrative style wouldn't allow for. So there is something radical about refusing to stand by any particular ideological narrative.
Excellent. Thank you, Julia. Sorry not to put you on the spot. That was a great answer. Thank you. Does anyone else have any questions that they'd like to pose our wonderful panelists for today? I also want to commend Julia on an excellent presentation very late at night where you are. I think it's approaching midnight if it hasn't already passed. So
Thank you.
I just wanted to ask Julia if you're aware that Urmila Seshagiri is editing a new edition of A Sketch of the Past with new archival material. And she claims it's pretty radical departure, and from the edition we've all been using for so many years. So you might, she's at University of Tennessee, you might want to get in touch with her about that. I don't know whether to make a difference in the form. And I also, listening to your wonderful paper, felt bad that our panel was at the same time as the life writing panel.
yeah.
Because I was like, oh darn, she should be reading in two places at once.
I know, I felt bad about that too, everybody. I was like, oh no, we were missing it. Anyway, it's okay. We're having a good time here. I think it'll be all right. Yeah, and I'm sure Urmila would.
I was just going to say, presumably we can hear the recording of the other session.
Yes.
I noticed that overlap too.
I'm sure Urmila would love to hear from you, Julia, and it does sound like an exciting addition. So I would definitely second that suggestion to get in touch.
Yeah, thanks for the recommendation, both of you.
Any other questions, or shall we take our break a little tiny bit early? I think that would also be reasonable at this late stage in the day. Looks good. Okay, thank you so much, everybody. That was a fascinating and wonderful panel. Excellent papers all around, and it was a real pleasure to see some of you again, meet some of you for the first time, and I'll hope to see you in a few minutes in the social. Thanks, everyone.